Hi, thank you for joining us today. My name is Laura Varela. You are going to see a reprise of last year's interview with Maria Emilia Martin, founder of Latino USA, radio journalist, and professor and advocate for journalism by Latinos and Indigenous communities. She passed away in November 2023. We are very blessed that we did one of the last interviews with her. And we are very excited that at least we have this interview with her and we can share her beautiful spirit and her stories of tireless work to show the realities of communities all over the USA and in Latin America. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at VoxFem Chicanindia. We're excited today to have Maria Martin. She is a treasure of a person, and I'm just so honored that she's here joining us. I want to tell you a little bit about her, and then we can get to it. So Maria Martin is an accomplished journalist with over 40 years in public radio. She has established herself as a respected voice in the field of journalism for her work in Latin America training journalists. She founded the award-winning English language radio news magazine, Latino USA, which is where I met her as a young intern while attending the University of Texas. Latino USA focuses on the US Latino community as well as Latin America. She also produced award-winning radio documentary series such as Después de las Guerras, Central America After the Wars, which aim to reintroduce the reality of Central America to US audiences. Maria currently directs the Gracias Vidas Center for Media, a nonprofit organization based in Austin, Texas, La Antigua, Guatemala, and devoted to the practice of independent journalism in the public interest. She has instructed journalists on electoral coverage, in multimedia and radio production and digital skill training with some prestigious partners like the Knight Center, the International Center for Journalists, and the US Embassy. She was also recently here in San Antonio, where VoxFem is currently based, and she was leading a training for a cohort of community journalists for the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center's Radio Esperanza, who recently received their FM radio station. Her books include Crossing Borders, Building Bridges, and her upcoming publication, Reporting Across Borders, a short guide to becoming a foreign correspondent, will be published within the next year. Maria's papers and archives are at the Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin. If you want to learn more, purchase her books, or hear some of her work, you can go to voxfem.org, where we will share links.
What a lovely introduction. It's always interesting to hear your life like it's passing before your eyes. Almost 50 years of it, right? In 30 seconds. Yay.
Oh, that was tough getting it down so short. So thank you so much, Maria, for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I could tell people in your bio, but I think they would rather hear it from you. And so I think we can just maybe get to it and have you, tell us a little bit about the work. I'll ask you some questions and whatever you feel like sharing with us. We're going to be honored whatever knowledge you're imparting with us today. So I spoke a little bit about your background through your bio, but can you tell us a little bit about your background in radio and how you became interested in radio journalism?
Well, being a journalist is being an observer, right? Kind of standing back and looking at the world and then trying to translate it actually to an audience. And I always say that perhaps my journalistic passion, that of an observer, began at home because I was the child of a bicultural marriage. My father was a gringo escapee to Mexico from Chicago, who came to study in Mexico on the GI Bill and met my mother there. And I grew up in Mexico for the first 6 years of my life and along the border in Arizona and Texas for the next 6 or 10 years or so, and then to San Francisco. So one, I lived in this household where there were two different cultures. And, my father didn't quite understand Mexican time, for instance, right? He loved Mexican culture to an extent, right? And, and so being in the middle, I think, and so many of us are bilingual, bicultural, right? In many ways, it might not be because our parents were from different countries, but as Chican Indias, we straddle different worlds, and so that's where this whole idea of crossing borders, building bridges, which is something that I've tried to do as a journalist, to try to bring understanding to people who have different worldviews. And it all kind of started right in my family. And then almost 50 years ago, I was a volunteer at the country's first bilingual, Latino owned and operated public radio station. And I tuned on the radio dial one day, and I heard English and Spanish and reggae and rancheras, and it was the first thing that I'd ever heard that reflected who I was as a bilingual, bicultural person with feet in several worlds, right? And so I was hooked on this little radio station. And I always say that still, even with the internet, in many communities in Latin America, that radio plays a very, very, very important role in bringing people together. It's a companion. It's a companion for people who go out in the fields. It's a companion in places that where people speak a number of languages, and maybe the mainstream media does not reflect that, but radio does. Radio is that local medium that speaks to people in their language about their music, about their issues. And that I think is such an important thing, that so it's not just a luxury. I think that in many communities still, even with the internet, and I think the internet enhances this, especially with transnational communities, right? So that you have, say, in Guatemala and in the US, many communities that are connected across borders through the internet, through internet radio. Right. Through internet radio, people can hear about what's going on in their communities. They can be present at events. They can see, for instance, the Sunday Mass or the Sunday religious service of whatever denomination it is, and they can attend. And there are places, indigenous communities throughout Guatemala where that have been marginalized from the government from a very long time. They get no help, but it is this connection through internet radio of the transnational communities that keep their highway services running, their health services running, that contribute to building schools and building churches, et cetera, et cetera. So radio is such an important medium. There was one incident when I was a very young, very green radio volunteer, and it was around midnight, and I was on the mic, and I got a call, and this woman was crying, and she was at the hospital, and she had taken an overdose of pills. But at that point, there were no bilingual health workers at the hospital. So she reached out to the one thing in that US community in Northern California that spoke to her in her language, right?
Wow.
And I was able to translate with a doctor and figure out what she had taken. And that incident showed me how important radio was, that it wasn't a luxury. It
Right.
really was as important as, water, air, almost,
Yeah.
for many people, because it reflected who they were.
Or a commercial vehicle, which is what many people think that radio is, when it really can be used quite a bit to connect communities, and it is. I feel like in the United States we have very little knowledge of community radio unless we are in part of a community que está interesados in listening to that, right? There's a need for it because I just feel like capitalism kind of pushes other forms of media down our throats first. So, right. So, like, as Americans growing up, Latinos, like, those are the first things you're fed, and you have to really intentionally seek those um, outlets out, when you're here. Otherwise, they can pass you by. So, that's a wonderful story. And that would definitely, because, when you help a human being save a life in that way, it affects you. And I think that's what happened to you. It changed you. And so, oh, that's a lovely story, Maria. Thank you. Um, so how does your work in Central America connect your reporting for Latino USA and NPR? Um, yeah, back when you were actually in Latino working on Latino USA when you were the executive director, and now.
Well, I think there's a through line to
Mhm.
all of my work, and that is, one, to tell the truth, right? That is to make good radio. That radio can be such an artistic medium where we can use the sounds and the voices to bring people to a place. Um, and certainly, I love video as well, but I think you can use your imagination a little bit more with radio, and then there is, my own passion and commitment to journalism, to telling the truth, to having stories being reflected that reflect all of all of the voices, as they say here in Guatemala, todas las voces, right? So here in Guatemala, they've fought for many, many years. The struggle still goes on to have community radio licenses that people can afford, right? And in the US, there was that movement that was part of the civil rights movement for affirmation, for validation, um, for the right to have our own stories be part of the media, and that took different forms in different media. But I happened to have started as a volunteer at a public radio station, and I thought public, that means everybody, right? And so, as you said, community radio, public radio, can be a medium to reflect all of those voices, but it hasn't always been. It certainly is a continuing struggle to have all of those voices heard, all of those stories heard, you know, and my own efforts to help make that happen, to make public radio really public, started almost 50 years ago at KBBF. I worked at a number of other stations. I worked for National Public Radio. I was National Public Radio's first and only, I believe, Latino Affairs editor on the national desk. Then, because it was very hard, even with a Latino Affairs editor on the national desk, to get these stories out that I thought needed to be part of the public radio landscape. Then I left National Public Radio to create, I could hear it in my head, a program that had Latino and Latina editorial control and administrative control. And so there was a project that people were talking about at the University of Texas. And I thought, and this was in the early 90s, Latinos have been in public radio at that point for about 15 years, that we could do something great, right? Because the idea, the mindset then was, oh, nobody listens to Latino programs except in Spanish. And nobody cares about Latino issues on English language radio. And I thought that just wasn't the case. And so I wanted to prove it. And so 30 years ago, this year, 30 years ago on Cinco de Mayo, was the first official program of Latino USA that is still on the air 30 years later. Mm-hmm.
Well, that is where I met you. And I have to say that I was there at the beginning as an intern.
You were.
And it changed my perspective forever in terms of community and how to view the world in terms of that bigger lens through kind of like these microcosms of stories, right? And I was just very grateful. It was a wonderful time, and I can say that I was there at the beginning, and I saw how it started and where it grew to and where it's at now. And it's just, you should be extremely proud of yourself, because
well, I'm proud. It really, sometimes it takes somebody to kind of get the ball rolling, but then that somebody, doesn't do it by themselves, but that somebody might be kind of key to keeping the ball rolling. But then there's all of these people, and you and Angelica Lueva, Walter Morgan, and Mariano Josa, and Beto Arcos, and Frank Contreras, and so many people that for whom that program has been an entree, right? Has given them, certain experience, and so for that, I'm really proud. This year, gave me that opportunity to recognize that. Yay, right?
Yay. It takes leadership and vision. Absolutely. And we were very lucky to have that from you.
Yes.
And speaking of that, I would like to talk about some of the award-winning documentaries. We had talked about, you have so many. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about, you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about Latin America, or Sister Diana Ortiz.
Well, actually, the book that I wrote, Crossing Borders, Building Bridges, A Journalist's Heart in Latin America, takes the Latin American chapters from my story, Crossing Borders, Building Bridges, which actually is the book that I hope to, it's the big book
Okay.
that I hope um, to publish this year. And the other little book is for people who are interested in perhaps becoming a foreign correspondent or traveling and reporting or traveling and writing, and that's called Reporting Across Borders: A Short Guide to Becoming a Foreign Correspondent. So, but yes, sometimes there are stories that really touch your heart, and I was going to try to see if I could come across the Sister Diana Ortiz story, just to read a little bit,
Okay.
because
And this is, I'm just going to show, this is from Crossing Borders, Building Bridges, which we will have a link to.
So let's see. It's well, this is kind of a long read, but
That's okay.
So it starts. I barely remember hearing the name Diana Ortiz when her story first broke in the news late in 1989. At that time, my life was in a lot of turmoil since funding had ended for yet another of the Latino public radio projects that employed me. As a result, I was no longer the host and editor of the Latin American news service, news from Central America, where conflicts raged in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. That was a big part of what we had covered. Had I still been employed at the Latin American News Service, I would certainly have been more familiar with the case of the New Mexico-born Ursuline Catholic nun who'd been sent to Guatemala to help the poor and teach indigenous children, only to be abducted and tortured by the Guatemalan military. Following her release, a few days after she was kidnapped from a religious retreat in Antigua, Diana Ortiz claimed an American called Alejandro had been present in her torture chamber. She asserted that he appeared to hold some authority over her captors. In response to this claim, and during the years she sought truth and justice, many people, including some officials of the Guatemalan and U.S. governments, called Ortiz a liar and worse. So this is the story of a very spiritual. She was really a young woman when she came to Guatemala. When I first met her, 10 years after these events of her torture, she was tortured, repeatedly raped, burned on her back 128 times, right? And by a miracle, so many people did not make it out of the torture chambers of Guatemala, but by a miracle, she did. And she spent so much time, one, trying to heal, two, trying to find out what had happened to her. Who was responsible for what had happened to her? Why was there a representative of her government in that torture chamber? And 10 years after this incident, I wanted to take up her story because she had spent many years trying to find out the truth. She had carried on a hunger strike in front of the White House. She had come down to Guatemala, been re-triggered, right? Having had people at the embassy of the time say things like, I'm wondering why all of these lesbian nuns come here to make trouble for us in Guatemala, right? They and let me just say that Sister Diana Ortiz's story, there was the story of her torture, there was the story of her trying to heal from torture, which was a story that affected so many, not only other people in Guatemala, but other people across the world, right? And even while she was in the process of healing, even while she couldn't quite remember who she'd been before the torture because it had been so traumatic and dramatic and painful, she found her mission as an advocate for the tortured, as a voice for the tortured. Her book, The Blindfold's Eye, My Journey from Torture to Truth, is beautifully written.
Wow.
And so she took this horrible experience and started a worldwide organization to help survivors, not victims, but survivors of torture. That made such a huge difference. And this was at a time before Abu Ghraib, before we knew things that, like, our government was also involved in
Right.
this horrible act, in this horrible violation of human rights, right? And Sister Diana spent the last 20 years of her life being never quite having healed, never quite having gone back to the pre-torture Diana. But as somebody said in another documentary that I produced about her story, so I produced one about her torture that aired on Latino USA in the year 2000. And then 2 years ago, when she died, I'd been about to profile her for a project of the University of Southern California's Center for Religion and Civic Culture that were profiling what they call spiritual ejemplars, or basically people who used their spirituality, whatever form that it took, to inform their social and to drive their social justice work. And so Sister Diana was on this list of hundreds of people around the world who fell into that category. And unfortunately, I was never able to tell the full story because first she got sick and then she passed away. But she passed away having touched the life of so many people. Oh, it's just people who just remembered her as this beautiful soul, people who were saying, now we don't pray for Sister Diana, we pray to Sister Diana, and in say many people, that she really exhibited very saintly qualities. And perhaps, in some ways, the reporting that I did as part of a project when I went back to school to get my master's in investigative journalism, that then became these 2 documentaries that won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, that told her story and that also told the story of what happens or what doesn't happen in terms of healing for all of those people who suffered torture for the 36 years of a very long civil war here in Guatemala and, you know, around the world. That is something that we as humans have not gotten over, and you know that man's inhumanity to men and women is still, you know, a reality. But in her story, as horrible as it was, there is the inspiration of someone who continued to be in service and who continued to talk about this. And she said, not because, you know, this is not about an American nun who was tortured, you know, it's about every man, woman, and child in Rwanda, in South Africa, in so many places where this continues to be a practice. So,
Oh my God.
so, so that Sister Diana, and in some ways, so many of the people whose stories that I'm told that I have the privilege, the responsibility, and the privilege and the honor to take their stories out to more people, you know? Um, so right here on my, let me just reach over here to my lamp where I have the picture of Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, who
Okay.
was killed. She was killed on the border by a US agent in 2018,
Oh
right?
yeah, one of the young girls
She
from
was,
Guatemala.
exactly, she was
Her.
barely in her early 20s. And here, I don't know if you can see this very well, it's not a great picture,
It's on it too.
but
We'll share it.
but um, but she had graduated. She was a young Indigenous woman with a degree in accounting, but she couldn't find a job. And that's a case for so many, many, many Guatemalans, especially from the rural areas, especially from Indigenous areas, you know, who, in order to help their families, to make any kind of life for themselves, are forced, you know, to leave. And unfortunately, she lost her life in the process. But so I was able to tell her story, and then she continues to to inspire me. You know, people ask me, well, you know, how do you get people to talk to you as a journalist? How do you, you know, I'm sure that
Mhm.
people ask you that question also. And when I went to her community, which is a very isolated community
Mhm.
up in the mountains and insular, it's a mom speaking Maya community, and so you can imagine, and then people are grieving the loss of one of their own. Her family is grieving, her father had been deported, and so she took on the responsibility then of trying to, you know, help her sick mother and bring her young brothers and sisters to get them an education. So she was going to go and try her luck in the States, and in that process, you know, lost her life. And so I decided, and so there was a lot of interest, you know, lots of, I knew that there would be a lot of international press at the wake and at her funeral. But I just printed her picture in her graduation gown, and I made like a little medal, right? Just to say, you know, I'm honoring her too, you know,
Mhm.
just like you are. And so people kind of wanted to talk to me. They saw that and they wanted to talk to me. You know, even if they didn't speak in Spanish, they were just speaking in Mayan. They still, especially the older women, you know, wanted to talk to me. So that's, you know, one of the reasons that I do why I do what I do is that there is a responsibility to tell these stories of people who can't tell it themselves, who don't have the platform, and where those stories need to be told, that the stories of migrants, you know, they're not often seen as human beings. They're seen as, you know, these hordes, right? Their stories are often told without context, right? About
Absolutely.
why would
Wow.
you leave, spend all of this money, put your life in danger,
All your
right?
family. Yeah. Historically, people, I feel like in the United States we have cultural and historical amnesia. So I feel like it's important, the reporting you've done has been important in reminding us that the US has intervened in most of these countries that have large populations of migration. And also I was saying about climate change, about how it's about 88 countries that are responsible for climate change, and most of them are in the US.
Yes, yes. And you know, Central America is one of the regions of the world that is feeling the impact of climate change, you know, with the hurricanes and the droughts. I mean, people's corn and bean fields was once upon a time all they had. Now they don't even have that
Mhm.
because that's drying up in
It's
many regions in Central America.
absolutely. Um, VoxFem executive director Annette Darmada remembers, and Lourdes Perez, they remember that you were one of the few editors and journalists that would respond to the press releases that were sent to Latino USA about Vieques, and other issues that were important to US Latinos and the LGBTQ plus community. Can you speak how your trajectory in journalism and time at Latino USA connects with reporting issues that are also important to this community? You know, when I talk about Vieques, I'm talking about Puerto Ricans and Latinos and people who are against government. How would you say what happened in Vieques? Like the colonialism, number one, but there was a US base there, and they polluted the area, the environment, and the people in Puerto Rico wanted them out.
Yes, and that was such an interesting story to me, that when I was reporting for National Public Radio, when I was an editor, I also tried to see what I could do to be a reporter because that was my passion, right? More than anything. But I became an editor in order to see if we could open the door to more Latino coverage. So, eh, and of course, the through line here is you can't report on the U.S. You can't report on the reality of Latinos without reporting on all of it, the history of Puerto Rico, the colonial history that makes Puerto Rico this kind of weird second-hand part stepchild of the US. So Maria Hinojosa, who was then the correspondent or a correspondent in New York, and I went to Puerto Rico to report on this series about AIDS in the Latino community. And at that point, um, Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans were being hit very, very hard, and they had little access to to these drugs. So this was in the early 90s. And of course, if you go to Puerto Rico, you have to look at the political situation and the issue of this connection with the United States. And Vieques, as you say, had that history of this was a place with a large military base that basically ran through most of the island, and people who had lived in the territory that the base took over were no longer allowed to go and visit their grandmothers who still lived there. And anyway, there was many issues, and as you said, the issues of contamination in a place that was absolutely beautiful and pristine once upon a time. So this was a great story, and it was a story that wasn't often told, you know. And so we went down and we covered those issues. But I think once again, to get to the point of who are we as journalists, and we are here to reflect reality, and we're not doing our job if we're not reflecting the total reality, right? And so that means that if you're reporting on US Latino issues, you want to make people aware of the issues affecting Puerto Ricans as well as Mexican Americans as well as Central Americans. And because there was a point when there was a huge Central American population here as a result of the wars, which, as you say, the US has had a historical connection or responsibility um, for that violence. There was a connection to that destabilized a lot of those societies, and we're seeing still these societies are seeing the impact of that. But you can't tell these stories without telling the full stories. And you can't, when I started the program Latino USA, you can't tell the stories of Latinos in the US without talking about the connections that there are to, in my case, Mexico, your case, Mexico, in the case of so many, to Cubans and to Puerto Rico and to Central America and to other countries. And I mean, it's such a rich story. It's like, why wouldn't you tell it? Because it's so wonderful and sad and full and all of those things, right? But
And people are dying to hear the history because now they're starting to ban a lot of Latino American history and African
isn't
American
that
history,
something?
Afro Latino history
Uh-huh.
in the US. Um,
We can just hope that the cycle will come
I
back, and
I
people
think
will.
so. I hope
Yes.
so. I have a lot of hope and faith in young people.
Uh-huh. That's why we have to keep on telling the stories. So at a time when they're not easily available to people, we're doing our best to keep that alive. So VoxFem and this program and this project, I congratulate that, because it's part of a very necessary effort that all of us have to be a part of in one way or another.
Well, one more question. So, speaking of the next generation and young people, can you share any success stories from the journalists you have trained in Guatemala? And can you tell me anything current? I know you just finished a current radio documentary called SOS Central America.
Mhm. Well, two things. I've had the wonderful gift of being in a position to train journalists in Uruguay, in Bolivia for many years, in Nicaragua before the crackdown on journalism there, and since maybe 2001 here in Guatemala. And as in many other places, Guatemala is experiencing a return to a dark past, a return to authoritarianism, a crackdown on the press. And when I started, it was still hard. It was maybe 5-6 years since the end of the war here, since the signing of the peace accords. There was some hope for change, even though there were a lot of barriers, but there was hope for change. And unfortunately, that seems more recently with the arrest of the country's most renowned journalist, a pioneer in investigative journalism in Latin America, actually, not just Guatemala, who is in jail, has been for a year, and um, is received a 6-year sentence when the prosecutors wanted 40 years for this man. And I felt I had to tell his story in a more in-depth way. It was told in a shorter way. It was told in print, and certainly, and but as I said, when we hear voices, when we are able to hear that, and I had started to tell his story 20 years ago, so I wanted people to know about this man, to know what a tragedy it was that someone who had been so committed to telling the truth, that he is paying for that in his late 60s, for God's sake, right? By being in a solitary cell with people, or imprisoned by people, by a system that sees him as the enemy because he reports on their corruption, right? So, yeah. So, in the 20 years or so that I have been training journalists, given that, they're always walking a tightrope here between trying to tell the truth and not be retaliated against by the powers that be, right? It is a difficult responsibility, and at times I have, asked myself, what is my responsibility to make sure that, they have skills as journalists, but most of all, that they stay alive, and that they receive, training in safety and security, and um, and this tightrope that that we walk here as especially people in the rural areas, people in the indigenous areas, where it's a very small world, right? And so they might live across the street from the corrupt mayor who has ties to drug dealers, who employs your wife or your sister-in-law, or who knows where your kids go to school. So that is a, such a difficult situation for them. And I've seen my role as just trying to make things a little easier, maybe, or to try to organize them so that they would have this network of support among themselves. And yes, there are people who tell me, Maria, you changed my life with when you had this, for instance, workshop in investigative journalism, where I connected, young or more inexperienced journalists from the provincial areas with, more, say, educated or experienced or elite journalists in the media here, to support each other and learn from each other. And So yeah, that's one one other thing that I've done, but it's always walking a fine line because you have to tell people that no story is worth your life, you know, you know.
Especially in this day and age where it I think it's not only a trend maybe in Guatemala, but throughout the world right now that there's a big attack on journalists and the truth.
Ex- exactly.
So
Exactly. And again, with that, we hope to see the cycle return. But in the meantime, we have to, support each other and tell the stories of those journalists who are bearing the brunt of, that necessary work of shedding light on reality.
absolutely. And for that, we're so grateful for your work, Maria. Thank you so much for joining us today here at VoxFem. I hope that people who see this program click on the links, hear more of your work, read your books, and support the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that they do. We all need support, especially if you're an independent freelance reporter and you want to tell those more in-depth stories. Everything, you know, takes resources to be able to travel and to have the equipment to record these voices. But it's been a wonderful experience to be here with you, Laura, to see how far you've come as a journalist and a filmmaker since those days 30 years ago. I can't even believe that so much time has passed, but that's life, and I love that you're doing what you're doing, and that I'm doing what I'm doing.
I'm
And
glad you're still working hard and training the next generation of journalists, Maria. God bless you. Que Dios
thank
te
you so
bendiga.
much.
And thank you for joining us at VoxFem Chican India. And once again, you can see links on our webpage if you want to learn more about Maria Martin. Okay, Maria, signing off. Thank you so much.
Gracias, gracias otra vez.
Bye.